Hello and welcome to the 10th of our Growing Care Farming monthly themed webinars. In this webinar, we'll be talking about the complex area of measuring outcomes and measuring positive change for your clients, your referrers, you, your staff team and beyond, and showing how a holistic approach wider than simply measuring outcomes can benefit your care farm or green care site. So welcome, and we hope you enjoy it and find it useful. So as always, some brief housekeeping points before we start. The webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the SF&G website in due course so that you'll be able to go back and revisit anything you've missed. Your details and attendance are private and won't be shared. Attendees are not visible via the video link and will automatically be muted. So don't worry if you can't see yourself or anyone else on the webinar. Any questions can be asked through the questions function in the menu bar. You should have a little box in the right hand corner or somewhere of your screen, and you'll see that there's a questions section that if you press the little arrow, it'll allow you to ask a question. You can type your question and one of the team will pick it up and ask it on your behalf at the end, or we can unmute you once recording is finished to ask the question. Also on this menu bar, there's a chat function where you can leave comments, and any links in the presentation will also be pasted into this so that you can click on them and view the information during the webinar. Okay, so you should be able to see three faces on your screens at the moment. So Katie Jeffries, our project officer, do you want to give us a wave? Katie will be monitoring the questions during the webinar and she's going to lead on the Q&A session at the end. Katie's going to be turning her camera off in a min and we will see her again at the Q&A later. So as I said before, please feel free to post any questions as they occur to you during the webinar and we'll pick them up after the presentation. And there's also on the question boxy bit, there's an option to post them either publicly or privately. So it's really up to you. So another face you can see on the screen, I'm delighted to introduce Sarah Giles, give us a wave, who until very recently was director at Farmability Social Farm in Oxfordshire. And Sarah will be leading us through the webinar today. And I'll let Sarah introduce herself in more detail in a minute. And finally, there's me. I'm Rachel Bragg. I'm the Care Farming Development Manager for GCF. For those of you who don't already know me, I've been involved with care farming in the UK for a long time, together with my colleague Debbie, of course, through NCFI and a Care Farming UK prior to Social Farms and Gardens. So why am I co-hosting this webinar with Sarah? Well, what you may or may not know is that I've got over 18 years experience working as a senior researcher and academic at the University of Essex, where I've been lucky enough to work with all sorts of different nature-based and other organisations to both evaluate and measure change and outcomes for beneficiaries. So specifically, my expertise is in creating workable and robust methodologies for using with real people in real situations, as very rarely is it possible or even a good idea to design your intervention around the research needs. So to give you a couple of examples, I carried out the EcoMinds research for Mind in 2013, which involved looking at the mental well-being benefits to attendees in 125 different nature-based interventions. So as you can imagine, that was quite a challenge as all the projects were different and doing slightly different things. I also worked on the very first care farming health and wellbeing benefit study in 2007, and more recently I've worked with the University of Leeds looking at the feasibility of a randomised control trial of care farming for people on probation. Happily, there are many researchers looking at care farming now, and the evidence base has grown markedly. So in this webinar, we'll be talking about the complex area of measuring outcomes. And we'll be showing how a holistic approach, wider than just measuring outcomes, can benefit your care farm or green care site. And we're hoping this is the first in a series of webinars on measuring change. So before I hand over to Sarah, I can see from the bookings that we've got a real mix of people attending the webinar, from care farmers that have been involved in the sector for years, right through to new and prospective care farmers. So we thought it would be really useful just to give a little bit of context, to update on a bit of history, to show you how we got here, and to highlight some of the recurring challenges. So in the early days of care farming in the UK, we found that although some care farms, and when I early days, I mean sort of 2005, 6, 7, something like that, we found that although some care farms were monitoring change, many care farms weren't really evaluating or measuring outcomes for their service users at all. However, we live in different times now, and the delivery environment has also changed, together with the requirements to show change and to evidence how your service works, both overall and for the individual. And now we see a huge variety of outcome measures used, from standardised methods to qualitative and bespoke ways of monitoring progress. So I could talk all day about outcome measurement in green care, but I just wanted to say, whilst we're on the subject of methodologies, that I really believe a mixed methods approach is always a good idea, as it enables you to tell your story in many different ways. I think the other thing I really wanted to say is that the debate over the best way of measuring outcomes in care farming is particularly long-lived and complex. I remember when we had green care researchers from all over Europe as part of the EU Cost Action 866 Green Care in Agriculture, way back in the early 2000s. And the whole point of that was to get researchers together to look at how we could progress research for care farming and how we could pool data from care farm monitoring across Europe to tell a larger scale story. And it was so hard. Every researcher that came together as a group thought their way was the best, and trying to get any agreement on approach, let alone methodology, was really quite challenging. So trying to find a standardized one-size-fits-all methodology for care farming evaluation is challenging, to say the least, and it's also a little bit, I think, like the Holy Grail. You know, we have so many different care farms delivering services to different cohorts in different ways, and there's so many variables that I'm not even sure it's possible. However, that said, one of the examples I've got up on here, the which tool to use approach, where you gather together some of the most popular and create a guide, like we did for the Growing Together project, was a really useful sort of part solution to this. So we know that many people find it quite difficult to decide on the best way to go about evaluation and monitoring, and how to navigate the enormous array of questionnaire and outcome measures that are available. And so you can understand why it's so hard to answer the, you know, which one's best for us, because there's so much variation between what they do, for whom and how. There's no one right answer. And I think the other thing to say here, particularly given that different funders and referral agencies require you to use different measures as well. However, there are some guiding principles and some tips and tools for choosing the right approach for your setup. And this really is what we're going to cover today. So I'm really pleased to hand over to Sarah to let her explain more and to talk us through the journey of farmability. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. That was a kind introduction. Yes, hello everybody. I'm Sarah Giles. Brief introduction to myself. I've worked in NGOs in the charitable sector for the past 20 years, and each of those aspects of my journey has involved some element of monitoring and evaluation. I joined Farmability as a volunteer in 2012, and as Rachel said, until December 2020, I was the director there. And for those of you who don't know Farmability, it's a charity that runs a social farming program on more than one farm in several locations, and the farming program is for adults with learning disabilities, many who have autism as well. So I'm really pleased to be delivering this webinar. I think I'm not a monitoring and evaluation expert, but I do believe in it. I think it's genuinely important, because I think if it's done well, it really goes to the heart of what social farming is about. Not what we do, but why we do it. It really touches on the purpose. And preparing this webinar gave me a really good opportunity to reflect on what I think we learned from the journey that we had at Farmability. So you're going to hear from our journey about the Farmability journey, but I do want to emphasize this is not about sort of promoting Farmability's approach to measurement. You've all got your own, as Rachel said, but this is going to be sharing our journey, but specifically picking out what I think we learned from that journey. And importantly, I really want to explore this whole issue about why I think we should be measuring change rather than measuring outcome, and to explore, if we look at change, where does that happen in social farming? So really, hopefully, that if you're new to measurement, you'll get a bit of a bird's eye view of it, and some idea of how to approach it. And if you're experienced, it might be an opportunity to reflect on part of your practice and maybe think about how you do measuring. So can you move on to the next, Rachel, the next slide? So I don't have control over the slides, so I'm going to have to give Rachel the nod every time we want to move.
Did that? Hang on a
No, it hasn't gone.
second. Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
Why isn't that working? Typically, things that work very well in practice. Okay, how about that? No, it seems to have.
Well, while you're fiddling, shall I just carry on anyway?
Yes, if you like, that would be great.
So the next slide that you'll see shortly, hopefully, is really looking at the journey. Here we go, brilliant. Thank you, Rachel. Fantastic. So this is the Farmability Journey. And so it started obviously with a question about why bother measuring in the first place. And really, we started measuring in order to understand what was happening and why it was happening, with the aim that if we could understand it better, we could strengthen that positive impact and really articulate it clearly to other people. And I think we also started measuring really because we felt a responsibility to the co-farmers, to their families, to the support team. They were entrusting themselves to us, and therefore it felt important to be able to say to them, not just this is what will happen, you know, this is the activities you'll do at Farmability, but actually why are we doing that and why are we doing it in that way. And I think also that decision to start measuring represented a sort of shift internally from, wow, this is a fantastic project, to actually thinking more long-term about Farmability as an organisation and how we develop and how we build our own skills. So importantly, at that point, it wasn't funder-led. That's not why we started measuring. So our journey, I think, our initial journey really consisted of two key sort of events. Firstly, we commissioned an external evaluation, well, sort of an internal external evaluation, to be honest, in 2014 and 15. That was predominantly qualitative, so it involved interviewing co-farmers, their families and support teams about what was happening and how people felt about it. It was really valuable because it really created a moment where we stopped and really looked at the organisation, and we learned a lot. And I think, if memory is correct, I think the main areas we saw positive impact were in the field of kind of generally of communication, of general well-being, of sort of team working and independent working, and obviously the obvious one was sort of skills development. There's two things that the evaluation didn't tell us which are important, and one is the extent to which any positive benefit that was noticed was attributable specifically to our programme, or whether it was also attributable to other things that were going on in co-farmers' lives. Obviously, people came to Farmability one day a week, but they were doing other things as well. So we could make a judgment, but we couldn't be absolutely guaranteed. And the other thing it didn't tell us really was whether the positive benefit that we could see on the farm extended to people's lives outside the farm gates. And I think that's a sort of ongoing issue within the measurement. But probably most importantly, it posed a question to us: how do we do this regularly, robustly and consistently? An external evaluation is fantastic, but it's time consuming, it's labour intensive. You can't roll one out every time you want to know what's going on. So we really felt we've got to figure out how do we do this more robustly and regularly. And that's what led to the second event, which was the Health and Social Outcomes pilot study about a year and a half later. And there, the question was very specifically, not so much what is happening, but how can we elicit what's happening? How can we understand what's happening? And to set up this study, we had pro bono support from a clinical psychologist and a clinical statistician. Clinical psychologist came to us, offered us his help. He was very interested, had a personal interest in learning disability. The statistician was a friend of mine who I just nagged for an awful long time until she agreed to help us out. But it was very interesting having these two people with their different sort of fields of expertise. I think Rachel will talk a bit more about this later, but we had this sort of tension between do your best and actually randomized controlled trial. That's what my friend the statistician was saying. You know, if you're not doing a randomized controlled trial, you can't know for certain what's going on. But it was interesting, and they were both brilliant, and it gave us a really good start to the study. So what we trialled during that study were 4 things. Goal setting I'll talk about later, but we trialled about 5 different measures, clinical measures of health and social outcomes, all specifically designed for people with learning disabilities, all sort of trialled and peer reviewed and everything. We then trialled a couple of our own. I just had a message saying, you've closed my webcam, Rachel. Can you hear me? I don't know if anybody can hear me, but I think Rachel might have just stopped sharing my webcam.
We can still see. I have no idea.
Okay, I'll just...
Sarah, if you're around still, other Sarah, webcam. I didn't even know I could do that. I haven't touched anything.
Okay, anyway,
sorry,
so
I think I've sent the request. It should be coming back on.
Oh,
All right,
thank you, Sarah. Other Sarah.
Right, so we trialled 5 measures of 5 different clinical measures that were all evidence and peer reviewed. We trialled our own approach, which is you'll all be very familiar with it. Smiley faces, sad faces, faces with a line for the mouth, which were very accessible symbols that you could use after people had been involved in an activity or at break time. We also trialled giving co-farmers cameras, and during the day, during activities, we encouraged them to take photographs. Afterwards, we used the photographs as a prompt to talk about what they were feeling at the time and what was going on for them. And finally, we trialled MoHost, which is an occupational therapy screening tool, therapeutic screening tool. And I'll give you a brief sort of overview of what it is. So we basically trialled 3 different approaches from clinical psychology, our own very sort of straightforward, accessible tools and methodologies, and this occupational therapy tool. And briefly, MoHost stands, so there's a model called the Model of Human Occupation, which is an occupational therapy tool, and MoHost is the screening tool that's used with it. The model itself looks at the motivation, the performance, and the organisation of our behaviour or our functioning as we're involved in any sort of work task or play task or daily living task. And the screening tool, MoHost, breaks down those 3 core elements of behaviour, motivation, performance, and organisation, into a whole range of core elements. And then the screening tool is used to assess someone's behaviour, broken down into those core elements, to see whether aspects of those core elements either restrict, inhibit, allow, or facilitate your engagement in an activity. So just as an example, I'm delivering a presentation at the moment, I'm using verbal communication skills. The screening tool could assess whether my verbal communication skills either restrict, inhibit, allow, or facilitate my engagement in this presentation. Please don't answer that. I don't want to know your response to that. Anyway, so that's what we used. And obviously MoHost can be used across a whole range of different social farming activities, when someone's grading eggs, when they're sowing seeds, when they're feeding an animal. So we used all of these, right. What did we learn? Well, as you can see, I could only find these really rather strange faces, so apologies for that. But clinical measures did not work. They were confusing, fairly inaccessible, very ambiguous, often very busy in the kind of pictures that they use. Some co-farmers found them okay to use, but the vast majority don't. We ourselves found them fairly baffling. They also oddly started with the premise that someone's well-being is very low, possibly because they're used often in a sort of psychological environment. But there was these assumptions of sort of low well-being, and often some co-farmers have very high well-being. So they really didn't work for us, and they were very complex, I think. With the pictures and photographs, anybody who's used the pictures will know they're pretty authentic. They give a good lived experience of how someone's feeling, but fundamentally, they don't tell you a huge amount. They just tell you really whether someone's enjoyed something or not. So they weren't perhaps quite sophisticated enough. The photographs, I think cameras actually have a lot of potential. It was great. They were really good prompts for discussions with co-farmers about what they felt was going on. But the problem is that they're fairly intrusive when you're using them during activities. We realised we need a lot of prompting to encourage people or remind co-farmers to use them and take photos. And also every time you take a photograph, it sort of interrupts what's going on, and it slightly distracts as well. But I think there's potential there that's probably worth exploring. So really what came out on top as the best approach for us to use in our context was MoHost. It seemed to be the best at capturing the sort of lived experience of co-farmers. It was pretty robust. If it was used by someone with training, we did send our resident OT on MoHost training, which was 2-day training and several £100s, but it was really worth it because it's one of those tools that's quite intuitive, and so it's easy to think, oh, I could just use it and it'll work, but actually you need to be trained in it. So we decided we would use that, but we recognised that it didn't completely convey the experience of co-farmers. And also with MoHost, you've got to decide on a day you're going to use it. So it's a kind of setup, it's a bit sort of prescriptive. So we felt it needed to be accompanied by something that was much more alive and accessible and daily. So we ended up with this combined approach to measuring farmability. MoHost, which we used at the recruitment stage of a co-farmer, then 6 months after they've been attending the programme, and then 6 months further on. We combined this with our own approach, which we called everyday breakthroughs. And these are daily observations of co-farmers' progress shared by programme leaders at the end of every single day in a daily debrief. We only had about 25 minutes or so for this debrief, so it was pretty short, but each programme leader would talk about the progress or the breakthroughs that their co-farmer had made, or several of the co-farmers they've been working with had made through that day. And we tied all this up together with annual reviews, which I'm sure many of you do, where the co-farmer, their family, support teams would come together and we'd have a review of the previous year and looking ahead. And I have to say, though, the everyday breakthroughs are brilliant in contributing to that, because you could create a sort of report with real, tangible, actual sort of facts and things that have happened for the co-farmer in the past year. So it was really useful. In terms of reality, just to say, the MOHOS never got quite carried out as regularly as we'd like it to. All these approaches are quite, MOHOS is quite labour intensive, it's quite time consuming, but our resident OT did use occupational therapy students on placement with us to deliver it and to do the assessment, which was really helpful. But yeah, carrying out reviews, even the annual reviews, it's quite easy to slip up on the timing a bit. But by the end of 2020, we've been doing this for about 3 years, so we had quite a lot of learning from it. If we can just move on to the next slide, Rachel, thank you. Before I go on to the learning that we gained from our 3 years of doing this, Rachel and I thought it would be really helpful to have a bit of a recap on the fundamentals of measurement. And this is, I guess, specifically for people who are new to it, but also just to review it for those of us who've been doing it for a while. So there are, I think, whoever you're working with, whatever kind of farm you're doing, whatever sort of activities, there are some fundamentals to measurement that really need to be in place for it to work properly. First, really, is that there are kind of 3 stages to measurement. There's the pre-assessment, or the baseline gathering of data. Then you have a period of intervention. Then you go in and have a post-assessment and gather your data. Then you have another period of intervention and you do a follow-up. So you've got a starting point, a sort of capturing data once people have been through the intervention or the programme, and then finally a follow-up to see whether any change or anything you've noticed has been sustained. Another aspect, which is fairly fundamental to measurement, is that it consists of 2 different and quite distinct activities. You've got the monitoring of data, which is when you're gathering your data on a daily or regular basis. And then you've got the evaluation, which is that point in time where you stop and you analyse what you've collected. And I think the only thing to really add at this point about that is that it's very tempting when you're monitoring to tweak and to intervene when you start to see things, or you start to see themes that emerging. But generally the advice is don't try and hold back, and don't judge. Wait until you get to the evaluation point, because if you're constantly tweaking and changing, you get to the point where it's difficult to know what you're actually evaluating. So resources, obvious one, be pragmatic, make sure whatever you decide to do in terms of measurement matches the available resources and capacity you've got. It's very easy to be over ambitious about measurement, and then you get into problems. But remember that you've got all sorts of people like volunteers, students on placement who can potentially help you with it. So be creative with who gets involved. Right, finally, attribution. We thought we'd just mention this. I referred to attribution earlier. Yes, fundamentally, if you're not doing a randomised controlled trial, you haven't got a control group who are not in part of the intervention, it is very difficult to be 100% guaranteed that the change you see is directly attributable to your intervention. And my friend, the clinical statistician, emphasised that point very strongly and robustly. But be aware that, of course, there's good information out there in the ether, reports and proper, robust evidence about, the connection between programmes of activity, approaches delivering that activity, and the kind of benefits that arises. If you're doing something similar and in your monitoring and evaluating you're seeing similar results, you can be pretty confident, you can make a very strong common sense connection between what you're doing and the outcome that you're seeing as a result. So my advice would be that, let's not get too hung up on it, but perhaps we need to hold back from making really expansive sort of claims for everything that we do. Right, now finally, before we move on, just to really emphasise, every type of measurement has got to be bespoke to the people who are attending your programme. They are the heart of it. It's the co-farmers who come to your programme, and they come for various reasons. So the more you know about why they're attending the programme, the better you can design your measurement programme. Some co-farmers might come with a very clear end goal in mind. It could be around recovery, return to work, return to school, to build transferable skills for the work environment. They may well have a goal or an ambition, in which case you can build that into the measurement. At the same time, they may not have a goal or ambition, and that, of course, is fine as well. And it may be that it's the essence of your programme that is why people come. It's to do something meaningful. It's to be part of a team. It's to get involved into the outdoors, to feed animals, to grow vegetables. There are all these things that could be the essence, and that's important to measure as well. But obviously, the more you know about your co-farms, the more you get to know about them, the better tailored your measurement can be. But one point, do be open and to be open to the unexpected. Don't be too prescriptive in measurement. You know, be open to serendipity. Things happen, and make sure you have a measurement approach that is broad enough to pick up on things that you didn't think were going to happen. Right, and finally, I think before moving on, it is important to remember that measuring is a whole team effort, because the activities and the way you deliver them is critical to the change that happens. So whatever you put in place really needs the agreement, the engagement, the understanding of your whole team, because they're all going to be involved. And if your team is diverse, make sure you reflect that in what you choose to do as well. Good. Next one, please, Rachel. Thank you. Thank you. So this is going back to our learning. So we had in place the MOHOs, the everyday breakthroughs, the annual reviews of co-farmers for about 3 years. Here's really what I think we learned from that experience. So the first important thing I want to raise is that we learned fairly quickly that we weren't measuring and monitoring outcomes, we were measuring change. When we first started with the everyday breakthroughs, we were looking for breakthroughs. We were looking for those moments of success or those outcomes where someone had done something differently than they'd done before, or something new, something they hadn't done before. But over time, what we actually realized is that we were measuring change, we were recording change, we were noticing change and progression. So small, often incremental moments that suggest the person is on a trajectory towards something, towards gaining a skill or to becoming more confident. But you wouldn't necessarily know what the end point of that trajectory was. The destination was often unknown. The changes showed that something was happening, that they were journeying, but we didn't always know where they were going. The other thing I think we learned very clearly about change is that it's interdependent. Change that happens in one area of the farm or in one activity impacts on something else. Everything is very connected. And therefore, you could see in the everyday breakthroughs that the debriefs were becoming more reflective, more discursive, more an exchange of opinions and thoughts and ideas, rather than a sort of monitoring of specific activities, specific moments. The other thing I think we noticed very clearly is that progress, as we all know well, it's non-linear. Progress isn't marked just by those moments of success. It's marked by setbacks. It's marked by problems and problem solving. So that's something that's important to measure as well, not just the sort of moments of success and outcomes. Finally, actually, just before I talk about goals, just slightly tangentially, but I was listening to a presentation by Claire Farrell recently, who's one of the co-founders of the Extinction Rebellion. And I didn't know she was going to be talking about outcomes, but she said something really interesting about outcomes that I think it reflects as well on what we do. She said that you're much more likely to be effective if you can remain detached from outcomes, and that you're more able to be in love with process and doing good for the sake of doing it, rather than hanging on for what's going to come, or because you're fixated on this final goal. And I thought that was really interesting, and it had something to say about how we monitor change at Farmability and generally in social farming. So yes, moving on swiftly from that. One final note about goal setting and goals. I mentioned this earlier. We did introduce, and we've tried lots of different types of goal setting, but it was quite challenging, really. We'd set the goals mostly during co-farmers' annual reviews, but often we found that the goals that were brought up were often goals really that the family or maybe the support team felt were important for a co-farmer to achieve, rather than the co-farmer's own sort of innate goals. Sometimes actually the goals that were suggested were not really attainable at Farmability. And the other practical aspect was that if every co-farmer, we had 50 or so co-farmers, had 2 or 3 goals to achieve, it's impossible for programme leaders, for the team to remember those goals when you're running activities. So goal fitting wasn't really a great fit for us, although there was clearly some value in having goals embedded directly in the activities that co-farmers are doing. So it felt like the more grounded and embedded your goals can be, the more useful they were, rather than the kind of blue sky thinking sorts of goals. So reflecting on all this learning, I was thinking, right, what do I really conclude? What do I conclude from all this learning? And I think there's 2 really important points. One is the interconnectedness of the change that happens and being open to that. Seeing the farm, in a sense, as an ecosystem where everything is interdependent and connected. And secondly, the importance of understanding the co-farmer, not just as someone who embodies change, but actually as a catalyst for change. And this second point was really prompted to me by the reflection of one of our trustee volunteers who spends a lot of time at Farmability. And he had listened to a reflection of a programme leader after a day when she had set up an activity for a co-farmer to do, something she knew he would enjoy. It was all set up, she had her plan all sorted. The co-farmer did not want to engage in the activity that she had planned for him. He wanted to do something completely different. So the programme leader had to go through a complete sort of volte fast. She had to rework what she was going to do, replan it, reorganise it, run something different. And it worked brilliantly. And the co-farmer, it worked really well for the co-farmer because the co-farmer, it was great in terms of choice and sort of self-determination and autonomy. But it was also really positive for the programme leader. And she reflected in the debrief how she had changed her practice as a result of this and what it meant for her. And Richard took this and he challenged us through this to look not only at whether and how co-farmers change, but whether and how we change, and to understand how that change is brought about by the intervention of the co-farmers, just to sort of turn the whole balance of service provider and service user. And I thought that was an incredibly powerful message. And I think combining the interconnectedness of change that happens on your farm and putting co-farmers at the heart of it is really important. And I think the reason it's important, I've been pondering on this, and I think the reason it is important is because it relates to your bigger vision as a care farm, as a social farm. Because ultimately, although we tend to measure things that happen on a day-to-day basis and what we're seeing, but actually, ultimately, if we step back, we've all got a much bigger goal that we're working towards, a vision that we're working towards. In Farmability's case, the vision is a more inclusive society. So if we think about it, if inclusion is the vision that we're aiming for, then we should be as interested in the change as experienced by other people when co-farmers get a chance to act purposefully and actively, as we are in the change that the co-farmer themselves experience. Because actually, that shows us both what change is needed in order to create more inclusive societies, but actually it shows us how people change and how great it is when inclusion is practiced. So I think if we can take those two things, looking at the farm and the much broader landscape of where change happens, but the co-farmer at the heart of it, then we're really kind of getting under the skin of why social farming is brilliant and what it can contribute to in sort of a larger way. It also allows us as a social farming programme or a social farm to evaluate and analyse that change and start to ask questions about, are we doing the right things to achieve inclusion through our approach and our practice? Are we challenging our assumptions about what works? Are we evolving and adapting? Are we an organisation committed to learning? So it really broadens it out, and I think it makes it a lot more exciting. Right, can we go to the final one, please, Rachel? We're doing all right for time, just about.
Yep.
So this is really just a summary of kind of what I hope I've covered. If there's more to measuring change than simply focusing on outcomes and simply focusing on the co-farmers, and if we can trust in the process rather than focus on the end game, then I propose there are 3 areas of social farming where we should be looking for change and we should be monitoring it in different ways. And this is really the start of the discussion, but I want to throw this out to you. So first of all, the organisation. And this is sort of, in a sense, saying to ourselves, are we measuring up well against the evidence that's out there about what social farming can do? There are some brilliant reports and evidence about how social farming works, what it contributes to, and all that kind of stuff. We should be reading those as much as we can and then reflecting them, having them as a mirror back onto our practice. Are we doing that? Do we feel confident that we're doing the best we can through our programme? And I would bet that nearly everybody is doing this unconsciously and informally. You'll be having discussions. Every time you tweak your programme, every time you do something differently, every time you discuss a challenge that's come up, you're improving and you're learning. But if there's a way to record that and connect it back to what you've observed, I think that could be really valuable, really good for sharing with others as well. Co-farmers, recording individual journeys. This is the traditional area of our focus, and Rachel said at the beginning, everybody's got their own methodologies. There are lots of different ones depending on who you're working with. But the important thing is that really listening as much as we can from the lived experience of co-farmers. And then finally, the bigger vision, measuring progress towards your vision, which includes measuring the change, very importantly includes measuring the change that is generated and influenced by co-farmers. And just as a final note on why I think this is so important, that, you know, if we really recognise the co-farmer as a catalyst for change, then we're acknowledging the agency and the autonomy of co-farmers. They too are agents of change. They're not simply service users. Just as we aren't simply service providers, we're experiencing the change as well. And as a sector, if we can monitor and evaluate this broader change, with co-farmers really at the heart of it, then we'll start to capture and articulate a much fuller picture of the kind of richness and the potential of social farming. And we'll be able to link what happens in social farming to the change we want to see in society more generally. So that's really it. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you so much for listening. Well, I assume people are listening. They might have wandered off, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. That was great. One of the things, just before we move into the Q&A session, I just wanted to sort of add to Sarah's first point on this slide, really, about evidence. We did a study a few years ago for Natural England, where we we spoke to a number of different commissioners and referrers of care farming services, if you like. And when we asked them, what sort of evidence do you want to see? And interestingly, they came back with that they wanted to see evidence of care farming or social farming as a whole, you know, as the sort of, I suppose, proving the principle, if you like, as well as the evidence for the particular organisation that they want to refer people to. So I thought that was really interesting. And as Sarah said, keeping on our organisational toes, measuring up against the evidence. One of the things the Growing Care Farming team are currently doing at the moment is pulling together many of the research papers and this evidence that Sarah's been talking about, pulling it together to make it a bit more accessible, so that and that will be available on our website soon, so watch this space, but to make it more accessible so that care farms and social farms can you know, find the evidence quite quickly in order to pull out the key aspects to persuade their potential commissioners, or, you know, to use in funding bids or whatever. So do watch this space. Now, I apologise, I haven't been following the chat at all because I was too frightened to touch my mouse in case I inadvertently turn something off. So I'm going to I'm just going to advance the screen if I can do that. So, technology, don't you just love it? Here we go. Right. So, Katie, we'll start with the questions and answers. I'm assuming, because there's a little blobby bit that's telling me we've had questions, that we've had questions. So, Katie, do you want to let us know what those are, and then we can field them either to Sarah or myself, depending.
Yes, so we've had a question from Mary asking if you could explain MoHost a little bit more fully.
Mm-hmm. I could. I wonder. It's one of those things you can Google and get endless sort of descriptions of it. But I think, adding something else to what I said. Okay, here's an example. So the model of human occupation looks at behaviour in these three areas: motivation, performance, and organisation. If we take motivation as one area of behaviour, MoHost breaks down motivation into 3 or 4 different aspects, and I think it's beliefs, disposition, and a couple of other things. It's your sort of approach towards what motivates you, if you think of that kind of broken down. I'm not an occupational therapist, I should probably add at this point, and then so if you're doing a screening, if you're looking at someone engaged in activity, you've got a list of those different aspects of the behaviour. So volition, motivation, performance capacity, it could be communication skills, it could be motor skills, it could be gross or fine motor skills. And then you look at you observe how they're carrying out an activity, and you grade their performance is probably not the best word for it, but essentially grading their performance using this 4-stage rating scale, which is restricts, inhibits, allows, and facilitates. So restrict, I guess, would be experiencing the most severe challenges to engagement. Inhibits is the next level up. Allows is when someone's fairly, again, probably not using the right word, but fairly competently engaging in something. And facilitates is the sort of I guess, what you're aiming for. If for example, if your communication skills facilitate the delivering a presentation, then that's fine. If your communication skills inhibit the delivering of that presentation, then you then be looking at, okay, what strategies, what approach can we put in place to increase that? So it's a good sort of measurement tool, because you can use it at one point in time, and then after a co-farmer's been at your farm for say 6 months, you can go back to the same activity and use the screening tool again and see if anything's changed. Ideally, I guess you'd hope that if something was inhibiting their engagement, 6 months later you might see it allowing or facilitating their engagement, because you've intervened, you've put something in place to help them, to enable them to engage more actively. So that probably wasn't a fantastically good explanation of it, but if you Google Moho staff, I mean, you'll get lots of academic sort of explanations for it. But I would guess if you know any occupational therapists, ask them to give you an introduction to it, because it is it's a good tool, it's useful.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I mean, I think it's one of those things with all outcome measures. I mean, one thing we can look at doing is offering, you know, as I said, this is sort of the first in a series of webinars and things about outcome measurement. So what we can do is look at individual measures, if that would be handy for people. But I think one of the things that I was going to say during the talk, I've seen it's really difficult choosing outcome measures, and sometimes measures that you think are going to work well and that seem to be quite easy to do. I've seen many examples where people have used them in slightly the wrong way and have come to, and their conclusions they've reached afterwards are then not right, because they've either used the measure in the wrong way or they've analysed the data in the wrong way, which sounds really, you know, I don't want to get into the details too much, but it's some of the pitfalls are there. And another thing that I've seen with some measures is that, you know, they were designed, it's this difference between state and trait. So when you ask the before and then the after, I mean, as Sarah's measurement that you were outlining for farmability, having sort of time one was pre, and then I think you said the next time that you did the Mohost was 6 months in, was it? And then presumably again at other stages. So that's yes, that's measuring trait, so a long-term thing that changes. And other measures, you can change whether something has changed over a session, like state. And quite often we see, I don't want to get too academic about it all because that'll just turn everybody right off, but it can be a bit of it can be quite hard. So as Sarah said, I think a Mohost, I was instantly, as soon as Sarah put her presentation up, I was instantly Googling it to find out what it is. And there is a lot out there and it looks great. So enough of me. Katie, back to the questions.
Yeah, just to add to that as well, our colleague Sarah Morrison, who's sort of in the background, has posted a link in the chat function to a YouTube video on Mohost, so that might be useful to people.
Thank you, Sarah.
We've got a few questions from Sophie, so I'll go through them one at a time. So the first one is, she was wondering if you could explain a bit more about the everyday breakthroughs approach. Do you make notes during growing sessions or hold this in your head until the debrief afterwards?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, in fact, there's another aspect of everyday breakthroughs that I didn't explain. So the everyday breakthroughs is held in people's heads. And I'm sure there's a question that during the day if you make notes, and it may be that some of our program leaders did make notes, but I think generally it was, you know, as most people know, on the average day on a social farm, it's pretty busy, it's pretty hectic. There's not a huge amount of time to step out of the program during the day. So generally, when we gathered at the end of the day, the program leaders would sit, they might reflect for a bit and remember, and then they started sharing. So generally, I'd say notes weren't made. What I forgot to add with the everyday breakthroughs is that we record them at every debrief session. They're recorded, so we recorded the program leader who made the observation, the co-farmer that referred to, the activity they were in, and the everyday breakthrough itself. And then on a 3-monthly basis, which tied in with our changing seasonal schedule of activities, we then analysed the everyday breakthroughs using the Mohost categories to sort of categorise them, to create a bit of a connection and a link between the Mohost tool we were using generally and the everyday breakthroughs. And that's why it was really useful doing annual reviews, because you could go back and you could sort. We we recorded everything on an Excel spreadsheet, so you could sort by co-farmer and see all the breakthroughs that had been recorded for the last period, whatever period you were reporting on. And that gave something really tangible and sort of very honest to share, and it was very valuable.
Brilliant.
Great.
That
Thank you,
answers
Sarah.
the second part of the question as well. The third part of the question is, do you include your co-farmers in those post-session discussions?
No, those our Farmability, the day ran from 10 o'clock to 4 o'clock for co-farmers. Our day was 9 till 5, and the co-farmers had gone home at 4 o'clock, and then the debrief, the kind of wrap up and the end of the day, took place separately. I suppose, I mean, realistically, you know, I mean, the good thing about everyday breakthroughs is that they would often pick up on something that the co-farmer had said or had actively contributed to during the day. So it felt, rather than MoHost, which is very much of an observational tool, someone standing back, observing something happening and recording, the everyday breakthroughs sometimes were observational, but sometimes also recorded a co-farmer's own contribution to the day or to an activity or their thought or opinion. So in that respect, it was a little bit closer to eliciting direct feedback from a co-farmer. But we did, I mean, occasionally, like many co-farmers, social farms, we did organise sort of feedback sessions, but generally the programme was about getting involved in the activity.
Sarah, can I ask, just while we're on that, you know, just for, as somebody that's never delivered a care farm session in her life, in terms of an everyday breakthrough, what sort of things would you record? Could you give us an example?
It could be, for example, it could be a longer engagement in an activity that someone knows. So a programme leader, maybe who was running a regular woodworking session, may have had a couple of sessions of maybe finding it more difficult to engage them, or trying to not being able to find the part of activity that really opened up that activity for the co-farmer. And when they did, they would reflect back and record that. Or they might reflect on a comment that a co-farmer made about how they'd enjoyed an activity, or not necessarily what they'd enjoyed about it, but a reflection on it. It could be a negative reflection on it, but it's, you know, it was something that was useful and that was important for people to learn, to hear. So it was generally very much focused on the degree to which someone is engaged or not in an activity, but also it could refer to a specific skill. If they've been working on building a particular skill in gardening, for example, it may be noticing they've really got it now, or now they're showing someone else to do it, or so it's really difficult given that there are so many. The point was very broad ranging, very, very wide ranging.
Excellent, thank you. Katie, any more questions?
Yes, so we've had another question from Leslie, who has said that she's often frustrated by not having continued involvement with the client over time to develop the relationship and to see change. So she's asked, how short term can our involvement be before we can measure outcomes?
Rachel, you can answer that
one. I think this goes, well, you could answer this two ways. I'm not sure whether whether that question could be twofold. It could be, how long do you have to work with somebody before you can work with them to measure change? Or it could also be related to the state and trait. You know, how long do you have to be doing an activity before you can you know, measure change? And that really does depend on what outcome measure you're using. So that's the way I'd possibly answer that. Sarah, have you got anything to add? I mean, I don't know whether it's worth asking Leslie to define that question a bit more. Sarah?
Well, just one thought on it. I think, you know, I guess it's sort of how long's a piece of string, but you know, I don't think we would have measured sort of 3 months or so earlier than 3 months after someone had attended the programme. You'd allow someone to attend for at least 3 months before you really start evaluating the change. I mean, you'll notice change from day to day. And with some co-farmers, I mean, I'm thinking of one co-farmer who found it very difficult it took a long time to actually be able to get out of the car and get involved in the programme. So if after 2 weeks or a month from sitting in a car, she's emerged from the car to actually go and wander over and look at an activity, that's clearly something that you would record. But I guess it's not, I'm under the question, it's less about monitoring, it's about the evaluation, isn't it? So you would monitor, so you'd monitor that, you'd mark other occasions, but you'd probably leave it, I think, for about 3 months until you really start saying, okay, what is this telling us? Because you may say that after 3 weeks, maybe this co-farmer got out of the car and went over to observe something. But that's not a decisive point, and that's not the way it's going to be forever. 3 weeks later, they may not want to get out of the car. So I think you've got to stand back and let things happen for a while, and hope. I mean, 3 months, I would say, is a pretty good starting point. You could certainly leave it for longer before you move, but that would be my recommendation.
Yes, and I think I'd agree with that. I think the only sort of slight caveat I'd put in that is that it probably depends on how long your co-farmers come to the project for, because depending on whether they've got a long-term sort of ongoing condition, or whether they are sort of stepping into green care for a short recovery period, if you see what I mean, it's very different. So if, for example, you've got a 12-week, if your participant is coming to your care farm for a program that lasts 12 weeks, then you might, for that to measure change, you may be looking at sort of day one. And then at that point, it may be that 3 to 6 weeks is a good time to measure, because that's the midpoint. So I think just sort of adding to what Sarah said, there is it's that whole piece of string argument, I think, and that's why it's so difficult to roll out a one-size-fits-all measurement process for all care farms. Katie, do we have more questions?
Yeah, so we've got another question from Lucy, who's asked, do you use occupational therapists for all your support work, or do you have a mix of practitioners?
Farmability Farmability always had a mix of practitioners. So for a long time we had, out of a team of 7, we had or 8, we had 2 qualified occupational therapists, one who was the program leader and one who's a progressions manager. And for the last 3 years, probably 4 years, we had a rolling program of occupational therapy students on placement with us from Oxford Brookes University, which was brilliant. So they'd come, depending on whether they were first years, second years, or third years, they'd come for different lengths of time, longer, depending on how sort of senior they were in their degree. But they would come, and they had their own sort of, ambitions and sort of expectations for their placement with us. But it's brilliant because they could bring, they brought very up-to-date practice with them, but very motivated, very keen to learn and keen to get involved. And so our progressions manager, who's an OT, qualified OT, was able to use them to help deliver some of this, or to carry out some of the assessments. So I think it was something that worked really well for us. I know we're not the only social farm that has this sort of arrangement with occupational, and I think social work students as well. We only ever had one social work student, but I know some social farms have lots of social work students as well.
Yeah, no, I just to concur with that, Sarah. Several care farms have good relationships with their local occupational therapy sort of training university to have that sort of arrangement. I know in Essex there is several farms that do this, and as you say, social care student placements as well. Katie.
Yeah, so we've had another question from Anna, who would like some more clarification on goals. So Anna has asked, if someone is referred to your service, is the only expectation that they are motivated and also have an interest in farming? And so instead of individualized goals, you are instead monitoring change as time goes on?
So again, this will vary hugely depending on who comes to your program and what they're coming for, but certainly with a lot of the referrals we had from adult social care teams, learning disability regional teams, the co-farmer was coming for, the goal would very often be to engage in a weekly, regular, outdoors, meaningful activity that was good for their well-being, good for their health and their mental well-being, and allow them to develop skills, to work with others. So those are all goals, I suppose, but they're sort of aspirations and expectations rather than a specific goal that you might have if someone came to you for a recovery, for recovery purpose. So it gave us quite a lot of freedom in that we could define goals potentially with people, that we could define their individualized goals with them. But as I explained, it also, defining those individual goals is not a straightforward process, and actually finding the goal that really relates to what that person innately generally wants is difficult. I mean, I often felt when we were talking about goals, I think, my God, no one knows, but I haven't got a goal for myself. I don't go around, I know you're meant to do that, but I don't have a series of set of goals, and here we are talking about how other people should have goals. So I think sometimes it can be a little bit artificial.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Katie, do we have any more questions?
Yep, so we've got one from Lucy who has asked, what is your ratio of staff to co-farmer? It sounds like you have quite a lot of staff working on this, and do you keep a file on each co-farmer where this information is stored?
I think yes to all of those. And in terms of the ratio of support, in usual times, 1 programme leader to 4 co-farmers. Occasionally more and occasionally less, depending on attendance. But the default is 1 programme leader to 4 co-farmers, which we felt is a number that creates a sense of a team within an activity. You've definitely got a group going on there, particularly if you have perhaps a support worker with one of the co-farmers, or a volunteer or an OT student, but small enough to allow for quite a high degree of individualised attention. That was that. What was the other bit? Sorry, I forgot the other bit of the question. Apart from the ratio, it was. Does everybody? Reports, files. Yeah, and absolutely, every co-farmer has a folder which involves information that we gather when they join us, which is getting to know you forms, a MOHOS, all sorts of other, risk assessment, all that kind of information. And then we keep copies of the annual report. So at the minimum of every year, you'd be adding to that folder with annual review information. But often there will be other bits of information added during the year as well. So you do, it's not an enormous file. Our intention, Farmability, is never to kind of have kind of huge A4 lever arch files of people, but to capture information that really records journey, records change, records progression.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've had another one from Emily who has said, when monitoring using the everyday breakthrough, did you also include any negative aspects so you get a 360 view of the experience and so that things can be improved?
To start off with, no, and I think that was a mistake actually. That was we kind of set ourselves up with this lovely positive term, everyday breakthroughs, which is brilliant. It is positive, and it's about shining a light on the really fantastic things that co-farmers achieve while they're at Farmability. So it was really great for that. But I think that was one of my learnings from us as well, that actually we would talk about the problems, but we weren't recording them. At one point we did have a discussion about this. I was 1 or 2 of my colleagues say, if we should be recording as well, because if they've been raised as a problem, the co-farmer or programme leader, the next stage is to problem solve and to put in place something that addresses it. And that's really important. That's learning, and that's just as important as just, because in a sense, if you're recording successes, you kind of record it, you celebrate it, and you put the lid on it. It just sort of stays there. I mean, obviously it doesn't, people then progress on from there. But if there's a problem recorded, you've then got to reflect on it next week and look at it, how has that been dealt with, which we did do. In fact, we did record a little bit. I'm probably underemphasizing it. We did record a bit, but I don't think for a long time it wasn't given the same prescience as recording successes, and I think that probably is a mistake. It's good to really address both of them.
Yeah. As a researcher, I would definitely agree with that, because that is where you learn, and otherwise you introduce bias. It's usually quite unconscious, but then all you can say about your project is that everything is always great. Where of course, if you can say, well, this happened, and show how you've problem solved, I think it's part of developing good practice. I think brilliant. I think we can, I'm having an eye on time. I think we could possibly squeeze in one more quick question before closing, if there is one more quick question. Katie, is there?
There's quite a few more questions, unfortunately, so I don't think we'll have time to answer all of them, but if we squeeze in one more. Duncan has asked, is there a process for sharing research results from setting to setting where they are delivering similar services? With low numbers of staff, some form of evidence sharing to support funding would seem to be important.
That's yeah, thank you, Katie. I'd say that what a question to end on. I'd say that's a really good idea, and from the thumbs up from Sarah, I'd say you'd agree with that.
Definitely. Yeah. I think that the way to really move forward with this whole question of measurement is to increase collaboration over it. We're all working with limited resources. By sharing, and it's easy to share. With anonymized data, we can manage that. I think it would be great, because it will encourage more discussion and debate and exchange of learning as well, which I think would be fantastic for the sector.
Absolutely, and that's what we certainly had tried to do sort of across Europe for care farming data. I mean, just while we've got you, before we move on, if we were to, because I think the next step for that, and also perhaps to answer some of these unanswered questions that we haven't been able to get through today, would be to perhaps set up you know, another event, a networking event where we can actually see each other rather than you know, so you can see everybody rather, and sort of to look at taking that forward, I think would be great. Do you think it's better to share data, because obviously is it by service user group, co-farmer group? Would that make more sense? Or is it, I mean, obviously a lot of people, this is something I say to the media that get in touch with us all the time, say, right, we just want to talk to people who we want to see a care farm that works with this group. And you're saying, well, actually, you know, a lot of people have multiple conditions at the same time, comorbidity. So, you know, how I don't know whether you could answer that, Sarah, where, you know, is a hint as to how we could possibly do that.
I think again, going back to the ones, there's no sort of one size fits all. I think that for I mean, if I'm thinking if I was still with my farmability hat on, I'd be really interested to connect with social farms who are working with people with learning disabilities and autism. We also started the Dementia Project, so then I'd want to reach out to farms who are working with older people with dementia.
Yeah.
If I can imagine if we were working with young people, with people with mental health, because you'd want to, so I think it's just setting up, there'll be people to connect with people who are doing the same thing. But yeah, it needs that would be your starting point. I think who you work with and connecting over that, and then growing out from there.
And I think certainly, I think we might look at doing some webinars or themed network sessions or something where we can look at that in more detail. So thank you so much, Sarah.
Pleasure.
If I can work out how to advance the slide to the last one. Yeah, thank you. That was, I'm sure everybody will agree, that was a really, really interesting and useful session. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. Just to close up, everybody who's attended will receive an automated email a couple of hours after this webinar with a link to our short feedback survey. So please do complete this, as it helps us keep track of who's attending, but also allows us to learn, adapt our work and move forward. So do tell us what you liked and what you didn't, and you can also let us use this to let us know of future ideas. We love to hear back from you. So this webinar recording.
Oh, sorry. Can I just add one? Sorry, could I just? Sorry to interrupt.
Absolutely, Sarah. Go for it.
Just to say, if there are questions that people send but haven't been addressed, if you want to send them to Rachel, and then I'm very happy we could answer them together, or Rachel could forward them on to me. So please, if there's something that's burning and you'd really like to ask it, please do send it on. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. That's really, really helpful. Cheers. So yeah, this recording will be on our website shortly, and please feel free to contact the GCF team for further information, or if you've got further questions, using the information that's on the screen here. And lastly, don't forget to follow the Growing Care Farming Project on Twitter, and do tag us in any social media posts you'd like us to share. So thank you very much, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
She says. Bye.
And we all sit there frozen for a while.
As we all sit here, so I can't remember how to close it. Right, quit.